rejoining us this afternoon. And first, I want to thank all of the speakers from this morning, Riley Price from MoPres, and Andrew Dial from SHPO, and Allison Ingley and Leslie McDaniel, also from SHPO. So we all enjoyed all your comments. Thank you so much. I hope everyone had a good lunch and stayed as dry as you could. And now I want to introduce the next talk, which will be a 90-minute session on both the federal and state historic tax credit programs. The tax credit program is the sort of the main tool for the economic tool for historic preservation and development. I'm introducing, here on my left is Ethan Starr, and on my right is Christopher Stone, my two colleagues in the Architectural Preservation Services Unit. And they both have a lot of experience doing historic tax credit review. And so without further ado, Ethan and Christopher.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Hello, everyone. I am Ethan Starr. Over here is Christopher Stone. We're architectural historians with the SHPO, once again with the Architectural Preservation Services Unit. And we are here over the next 90 minutes to talk about the federal and state historic tax credit programs for rehabilitation projects. These tax credit programs provide financial incentives, what I know many of us here were hoping to hear about today, so we're finally getting to it, for preservation and development. Yes, there we are, our slide of topics 1 through 7. We're going to run through a lot of different things today. But first, turning to basics on rehabilitations. What is the purpose of the programs? And we'll get straight into it. Okay. The purpose of the program, as spelled out by the National Park Service and at a state level, if you look at our statute as well, is to encourage the protection, preservation, continued use of Missouri's diverse range of historic architectural resources. And number 2, it's also for the purposes of economic development. Note that it is stipulated this is a dual purpose program and annual allocation. It's not just for preservation. It's particularly the federal program is to bring historic buildings back into working order and to become, once again, economic contributors. We saw this graphic earlier today. It's a good one, though. It helps us visualize the differences between programs. They have different partners involved, came about at different dates. So once again, these are the 2 programs, federal and state. Some similarities, some differences. Biggest one here, smallest text perhaps, but 20% federal historic tax credit versus a 25% tax credit for that state program. They can be stacked together. So in the aggregate, you can aim for a 45% tax credits calculated with your total of qualified rehabilitation expenditures. Perhaps the biggest difference between the programs is, of course, federal tax credits being only available for income-producing properties, while state tax credits are more flexible in a sense, available for non-income-producing properties, such as an owner-occupied residence. For federal applications, and this gets into the graphics for all our partners here, lots of cooks in the kitchen. The NPS forms are submitted directly to the SHPO offices. We review the application, those of us in the APS unit, and then forward it to the National Park Service for their review. For the state applications, the Department of Economic Development forms are submitted to them through their own submittable process, which is changing a little bit, but again, it's their program. They are the intakers, and DED reviews the application for economic eligibility, for completeness, hopefully, and forwards it to us for the architectural review. The new legislation, which I'll let Deb discuss in more detail if she's prepared to do so, has not been signed by the governor yet, I should say, passed both houses of the legislature. It proposes raising the state tax credit to 35% instead of 25% for everywhere outside of parameters it describes that are essentially St. Louis and Kansas City. If the governor signs it, it would go into effect potentially for new applications submitted after the end of August. On to what is a tax credit? A tax credit is issued crucially at the completion of a project, so they do not provide upfront funding or initiate or pay for a project that is in process. This is not grants in that sense. Again, there are some differences between the federal and the state programs in this area. The federal program has its tax credit distributed the 5 years following the certification of a completed project. We call that the recapture period. And so you receive the 20% tax credit, but you receive 20% of that total staggered in each year. And you must claim the year you receive that final certification or you lose it. Now, because that's a 5-year payout essentially of your tax credit, the historic structure does remain under review. The project, even though it's been certified as final, is still subject to review if you were to, say, add a garage in the rear or new additions, major additions to your rehabilitation project. And would need to be submitted to the SHPO to ensure they meet the Secretary of the Interior standards, a concept which we will cover thoroughly later. The other major aspect of federal tax credits is that they are non-transferable. They cannot be sold. They can only be used by the owner of the property, the owner applicant, or one of their partners if it's multiple individuals in that LLC, say. Now, unlike federal tax credits, Missouri tax credits can be sold. They're often sold at a variable market value. We'll hear about that later as well. Got a whole presentation for it. Typically, you get 70 to 80 cents on the dollar when you sell those state credits. And of course, federal tax credits can be used to pay federal taxes, and state tax credits can be used to pay state taxes. Handing over to Chris.
Yeah, so we're going to do a little term description here. So what is rehabilitation? So the National Park Service outlines 4 different approaches to historic buildings. Those are preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Most important thing to know is that historic tax credits follow our rehabilitation. There are standards for that laid out by the National Park Service that we follow. And I will, for the sake of time, not go into describing exactly what all the others mean, because they don't really apply to tax credit projects. Let's see, but rehabilitation is the act or process of making possible a compatible use for a property through repair, alterations, and additions while preserving those portions or features which convey its historical, cultural, and or architectural values. Rehabilitation acknowledges the need to alter a historic building to meet a new use. Importantly, rehabilitation is the one approach laid out by the National Park Service that allows for change in a historic building, which is why we use it for the tax credit program. We recognize that old buildings sometimes need new uses to keep going on. And that is essentially what that third point there is as well. What are qualified rehabilitation expenditures? This is very important. This is what your tax credits are based off of. So qualified rehabilitation expenditures, or QREs, as we oftentimes refer to them, are they're expenditures that, I mean, as the term says, are qualified. These are things like structural components of a building, walls, floors, ceilings, etc., as well as permanent coverings, and some soft costs as well. This includes costs associated with work undertaken on the historic building, architectural engineering fees, development fees, and there are slightly different criteria that the state and federal programs use for determining what QREs, what qualifies as a QRE, but essentially they're the same. There's some minor differences though. This is important. Note that even if an expenditure is not considered a qualified rehabilitation expenditure, it still comes under SHPO and MPS review, because the standards call us to evaluate the whole of site and environment when we do these reviews. And so even if something is not necessarily a QRE, it still has an impact on the historic structure. And so we also review that. This is a great graphic we have to help just better visualize what counts as a QRE. So essentially, if you take a house, turn it upside down and shake it out, whatever is left is generally considered a QRE. It's just a fun little way to remember what counts. What is not a QRE? There are several costs that do not count as QREs. Most frequently, those are things like landscaping, acquisition costs, furnishing costs, new additions, new construction. These things are items that are generally not considered as qualified rehabilitation expenditures. And so the steps involved in a historic tax credit application, it varies a little bit between the federal and state program. So with the federal program, you have a part one, which is essentially just identifying, is this a historic resource? Is it listed on the National Register? Is it not listed on the register, but it might be eligible? These are things that we figure out in the part one of the federal program. And then your part two in the federal program is where you propose your scope of work for what you're intending to do with the property. And then there's a part three when the project is completed that essentially is just for us to verify that the work was done as proposed. And somewhat similarly with the state program, there's a part 1A and B. As you can see, the part 1A, similar in that it identifies whether it's a historic resource. And part 1B is where you proposed your scope of work, and part 2 is your final.
Excellent. We'll move on to eligibility next. And Chris, if we could go back a slide. It can be confusing lining up all the numbers next to one another, but I just want to underline the understanding that where the project happens, where the work occurs, is between the line that is proposed scope of work and the bottom row of completed work. So that's where we expect that you are beginning work after receiving that signed approval, and that if there are changes in the project, that's where it's most likely that amendments will be submitted. And we'll talk more about each of those subjects later. Thank you for putting that graphic in, Elizabeth. Eligibility. Questions of who can apply, who's eligible, and what buildings. Similarly, any Missouri taxpayer can apply for preservation tax credits to rehabilitate quote-unquote certified historic structures that they own. Not for-profit entities and government entities are importantly not eligible to apply for either state or federal historic tax credits. That is something about that recent legislation that has passed the legislature, not been signed into law, affecting the Missouri State Historic Tax Credit Program. It would change the eligibility status for nonprofit entities. But what is on the screen is the current law. What projects are eligible? That is determined by the 4 qualifiers we see up here, and we'll do a slide for each of them. Okay, so certified historic structure, what does that mean? Well, that's what we were talking about all morning. It must fall into one of the 3 categories, either individually listed on the National Register or a contributing structure within a National Register historic district or a contributing resource in a certified local district. Again, that's in Missouri, just sort of a Kansas City, St. Louis phenomenon. But typically we're seeing either a building or complex individually listed or a building within a National Register district, which was deemed to be a contributing resource. This is where that website map comes in. Again, you can access it through the National Register page, or Maps and Records is what we have highlighted here. Love an interactive map, of course. It's generally reliable. And if you do have any questions about it or about other eligibility items, do call us. This is the stage at which it is always a good idea to check in. Yes, moving on. More website instructions. Oh, there we go. Okay, what doesn't qualify? Just as Chris mentioned with landscape features not qualifying as QREs, non-qualifying or structures that are not habitable or not buildings, essentially, are not qualifying as historic tax credit projects in the sense that you can't dwell in them, you can't run a business with them. So particularly for the federal program, these are not an income producing structure, and they need to have physical integrity. Non-historic surface coverings must be removed to make sure that there is enough historic material remaining in the case, say, you have a covered building on a downtown strip. A lot of things that come in, and we're talking about the part 1 of the federal application as Chris showed in the numbers there. Oftentimes we'll see multiple buildings on a lot. People have garages and other outbuildings. So much of that process is about determining what structures are contributing to the historic district and what are not. A lot of that determination relates to the period of significance of that historic district, say. But yes, can cross off tax credits for your bridge project. Let's see. The rehabilitation must be done according to the Secretary of the Interior's standards. That is a big one, and we will return to that in a few minutes after finishing up this section.
Yeah, and both of these first two requirements apply both to the federal and state programs, as you can see there. So number 3 on our list is that the project must meet the substantial rehabilitation test. And you might be asking, what is that test? How do I know if I meet that? Well, we strongly advise that you consult with an accountant or tax attorney or the IRS to determine whether these incentives apply to you, and also to do this test as well. But there's a general formula that you can follow to figure it out. This is for the federal. There is a slight difference between how the state and federal determine what a substantial rehabilitation is. So the federal substantial rehabilitation test is that the project must cost, the cost must be greater than the adjusted basis or $5,000, whichever is higher. And you can find adjusted basis by taking your purchase price, minusing the value of the land, and then minusing depreciation, then adding improvements to that. And that is how you determine your adjusted basis. I thought I had, I don't have a slide for it, but for the Missouri state tax credits, the substantial rehabilitation test is that the costs and expenses associated with the rehabilitation must exceed 50% of the total basis of the property. That is your acquisition cost, what you paid for it. All right, and our number 4 qualifier for the federal tax credit is after rehabilitation, the historic building must be used for an income-producing purpose for at least 5 years under the same owner. So it has to be income-producing, and you can't sell it. Otherwise, you're forfeiting those tax credits. Yes, and this is what we refer to as the recapture period, this 5-year period after completion of the project. And during this period, if you have any alterations or changes to the project, it must still be submitted for review to SHPA. If it falls within this 5-year period. Yeah, it must be income producing. So owner occupied residential properties do not qualify for the federal rehabilitation tax credit. And the tax credits are dispersed at 20% per year for 5 years. So for that 5 years, you just divide your total tax credits by 5, and that amount is what you get each year. So they just divide it up over the 5 years. So you don't get a lump sum, you just get it piecemeal. And you must claim the tax credits the year you complete the project. Otherwise, you will lose the tax credits for each of those years that you do not claim them. So it's essentially like the clock starts as soon as you complete your project to claim those credits. And if you don't claim them, you don't get them. And again, federal tax credits are non-transferable as opposed to the Missouri state tax credits. So what if my property is not listed on the National Register, but I think it should be? This is where the PDIL comes in to play. A PDIL is a preliminary determination of individual listing. but nobody remembers that, so that's why we say PDIL. And there you go, preliminary determination, individual listing.
Very dramatic.
Yes. This is essentially an eligibility assessment for the property. It's not as substantial as a National Register nomination, but you're submitting enough info to us to make the determination that, hey, yes, we agree this could be listed on the National Register. And then it would let you move forward with the historic tax credit program, even if it is not already listed. The caveat to that is that by the end of your project, if you have a PDIL, you must have your project, the property, listed on the National Register by the end of your project. So PDIL lets you start the project without a National Register listing, but it must be listed by the time that you complete the project.
You have some bullets on Ben.
I do have some bullets. Yes, you can request the PDIL at the part 1. That is where you request that while we're determining whether it's historic or not. Yeah. You will need to work with the National Register and Survey Unit of our office to complete this. And yes, that last bullet point there is what I was saying. Your federal tax credit can move forward at your own risk, is what we say, before it's officially listed. But it would have to be listed by the end, at least. And important to note that this is not true of the state tax credit program. Currently, the state tax credit program does not allow PDILs. So for the state tax credit, you must be listed on the National Register before beginning that process. PDIL cannot be used for a historic district, only for individual listings. And if your property is potentially part of a district, then it must be nominated to that district. So there must be a boundary increase or what's the other term for it? There's another term for.
Or a new district.
Yeah, or a new district. And CLGs can apply to SHPO for grants to fund surveys or preparation of a National Register nomination. I think we heard from Andrew Earls.
This is why we had you come this morning.
Yes. All right.
Okay, on to part 3. Planning a project. Are perhaps unsolicited thoughts on as to what will help you successfully get through this process. And having seen a lot of people go through it, we have a decent idea of what are some best practices. Who else is needed? Of course, there are lots of projects, large and small, but typically we see architects, engineers, GCs, subcontractors. We highly encourage everyone conducting an HGC project to hire professionals that are familiar with preservation standards, working with the tax credit process itself even, so that they're familiar with approvals, for example, and when they can move forward with a certain feature and not with another. This includes tradespeople like masons, plasterers, who have been trained to work with historic materials. Of course, the program, the federal program in a large scope in particular, is designed with the hope of incubating an ongoing transfer of historic trade skills down through the generations. And we do see out in the field that it seems to facilitate that. Another industry the tax credit process facilitates is that of preservation consultants. Note that they are not required, but they can be very helpful throughout the process. Oh, and a Venn diagram next. Love that. So again, not every project is going to look the same in the makeup of its team, its stakeholders, its owner developer partnership schemes. But our point here, whether or not you have a consultant, for example, is that whoever the team members are, it's good to have the communication of whatever you submit on your historic tax credit project come out of the middle of that circle, so that you are all on the same page from the project team of what you are submitting to our office, so that there isn't, say, a submission from two people simultaneously, or a conflicting understanding. This happens a lot, actually, between the owner, a consultant, and maybe an architect or a contractor working on the property. That means that on the reverse side of the communications you hear from us, it's always helpful to forward that out to the entire project team so that everyone stays updated as to where the project stands. For larger and more complex projects, our idea of some best practices is that those team members have clearly defined roles, an established communication system with brainstorming sessions early on that I will put out our availability for pre-application consultations if you have questions about the scope of work in a project or about whether a certain treatment adheres to the standards or not. That is something we're happy to talk with you about, and we can even bring issues to our National Park Service reviewers for preliminary comment. And particularly when a project hinges on a particular idea that's still molding in your mind, we understand that it can be helpful both to have our stated understanding of it and definitely having the whole project team on the same page.
All right.
Now on to those standards.
On to the standards. So, as I said before, the Secretary of the Interior produces standards that we abide by. This is what we evaluate projects off of. And specifically, the standards for rehabilitation are what we use for tax credit projects on both the federal and state historic tax credit programs. And we do have copies of these standards. That's the yellow sheets that we have on this table over here. If you happen to grab a page of that, those are the standards. Yes, there's a nice, pretty book that the National Park Service also puts out, if you care for that. A successful rehabilitation project, whether large or small, will meet these 10 standards for rehabilitation that, again, have been set by the Secretary of the Interior. And so NPS has established a rehabilitation hierarchy, as they call it, which helps with interpreting these standards. First is to identify, retain, and preserve historic materials and features. So guidance begins with recommendations to identify the form and detailing of those architectural materials and features that are important in defining the building's historic character, and which must be retained to preserve that character. Guidance on identifying, retaining, and preserving character-defining features is always given first in the NPS guidelines for applying the standards. Second, we have protect and maintain historic materials and features. And protection generally involves the least degree of intervention. So it includes ensuring that the property's historic materials and features are protected before and during the rehabilitation process. Third, we have repair historic materials and features. Rehabilitation guidance for the repair of historic materials, such as masonry, begins with the least degree of intervention as possible. This includes the limited replacement in kind or with a compatible substitute material of extensively deteriorated or missing components or features. And number 4 here is replace deteriorated historic materials and features, and only if it cannot be repaired and only with compatible materials. So ideally, we want to preserve what is there. We want to, second, protect and maintain it. If we need to, we will repair, and then fourth and finally, if need be, replace. Before you can replace materials, we do want extensive documentation of the deterioration that requires replacement. And so, yeah, there's a great question. Is this window here deteriorated beyond repair? Some would say yes, some would say no. All right.
Yes.
What? Maybe yes, maybe no. It depends on who you ask. As somebody who used to do window restoration, I would say that is not beyond repair. But some other people in our office think it is beyond repair. That's all I'll say. So yeah, we'll go through each of the standards here and just kind of give a brief overview of them. So starting with standard number 1, a property shall be used for its historic purpose or be placed in a new use. Here's where, this is rehabilitation. The standards for rehabilitation allow for new use. Or placed in a new use that requires minimal change to the defining characteristics of the building and its site and environment. There's that site and environment terminology for you that we use when we look at new additions and the such. So most often, a great example of this is an old school. We see lots of historic schools rehabilitated throughout the state. This is one in St. Louis, which I believe is a William Ittner designed school. Oh no, it is not an Ittner school.
A little early.
I glanced at my notes a little too briefly, but
It was a little earlier.
okay.
It's very much in the same.
But we do have William Ittner schools here in Springfield, which is nice. So here's a hallway from that school. You'll note that here's our wonderful before and after photos, which we love. We love our before and afters. And school buildings converted to apartments should retain original features whenever possible, such as chalkboards in former classrooms, original tile, doorways, especially in the corridors, which we consider primary spaces. So there is this idea of primary and secondary spaces when we're interpreting the standards in the tax credit program. So primary spaces are generally public spaces, public-facing spaces. So your corridors, your historic entryways, spaces that generally saw the most public use. Secondary spaces would be bathrooms, kitchens, stuff like that. It's generally not, the most public of spaces. And so there tends to be more leeway with secondary spaces, the changing out of materials and design versus primary spaces. We tend to have a more strict view of what should be retained in those spaces. So a corridor like this is a primary space because it is most visible to the public. And because of this, it is important to avoid drop ceilings, as you can see used to be in that corridor, as well as soffits and exposed ductwork whenever possible. Here's a classroom from that same school. Large windows like that are important to retain the overall character of that classroom and would be considered a character-defining feature of that classroom. It's that large bank of windows there. Oh, and here's a great auditorium from a rehabilitation of the Attic School in Kansas City. Part 3 for this just came through our office, and believe it or not, the ceiling in this school actually was caved in when they started this project. And through historic documentation and what was left, they were able to reconstruct it. And yeah, it's beautiful. And you can see they've retained the volume of this space. A lot of times we see proposals to divide these historic gathering spaces into small apartments, which sometimes, is acceptable, but in general, a large auditorium space, again, can be considered a primary space, and we would want to see, say, the volume and the character of that space retained.
So as not to compromise the legibility of that space, right? And that goes into standard 2. Historic character of a property shall be retained and preserved. Removal of historic materials or alteration of features and spaces that characterize a property shall be avoided. So you've heard this term from Chris already a couple of times, character defining features. To summarize, those are essentially features without which a building would be endangered of losing its integrity. So in order to preserve that integrity, which, by the way, all properties, all projects that complete the historic tax credit process, by adhering to the standards, they are certifying that they retain integrity. So that means that they need to retain character defining features. So what's an example of these? Well, it includes visible features like the chimney breast seen in the photo on the left there before the rehab. Now in this project, in the process of furring out the walls to add insulation, the general contractor brought the wall flush with that chimney breast. In order to finish the project, receive credits, remediation had to be performed to restore that historic profile, to communicate that that is where a chimney breast lies and that it stands proud, because that is a central defining feature of this living room space, I presume. This really underscores also the importance of communications with all members of the team and with your SHPO reviewers before your contractors, subcontractors go in and do work, so that everyone knows what designs have been approved by the National Park Service. Again, assuming that this is a federal project. Standard 3. Each property shall be recognized as a physical record of its time, place, and use. Changes that create a false sense of historical development, such as adding conjectural features or architectural elements from other buildings, shall not be undertaken. To avoid treatments that do not meet this. Oh, I'm sorry, I just kept on reading. Like that was part of the standard. No, standard 3 is a good one. And this is about not creating a false historic impression. As you can tell from the language there, it's often pertaining to features that are added that would, say, create the impression that a early modern Foursquare, say, had Victorian features, where that wouldn't have been the case for, an arts and crafts house. Changing the appearance and therefore understanding of a property through the addition of features. What I love about Elizabeth's example here is that it's actually the subtraction of a feature that creates a false sense of historical development. This is a property in Arrow Rock where the owner restored the cabin by removing historic plaster from the walls and ceilings to reveal the large timber construction. This plaster finish, however, was part of the historic fabric of the house. It would have been an item of prestige to have an interior finished wall, and its removal does create that false sense of historical development. Therefore, this treatment does not adhere to the standards. Similarly, exposed brick should be avoided in historically finished interiors. Note that many industrial spaces, say, would not have been historically finished, but in a residential setting, for example. Oh, and to avoid treatments that don't meet the standards, once again, all caps at your own risk. If you proceed with work prior to receiving signed approval, all caps suggest that you wait for signed approval before implementing your proposed treatments, whether that approval is coming from the National Park Service or from the Department of Economic Development, if, say, you're a state-only project. Okay, standard 4. Changes that have acquired historic significance in their own right shall be retained and preserved. So this is discussing the possibility that over the passage of time, a feature that might not have originally been considered historic, or rather contributing to the historic significance of a property or a National Register district, that its continued use and existence may justify a new understanding that it acquires historic significance. This happens oftentimes when a 1970s or 80s National Register nomination is on the books, doesn't see something from the earlier mid-20th century, for example, as historic. Here is a good example, the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum in Hannibal. As a child, Mark Twain lived in the 2-story wood-framed house on the right, of course, from 1844 to 1853. In 1937, the Works Progress Administration built a large 2-story stone building immediately adjacent to the house and a big stone retaining wall behind the property. The stone building originally served as the Mark Twain Memorial Museum, today still generally in that function, and the stone wall was a firewall protecting the property from a nearby lumber yard. Today, adding this large stone building immediately next to a historic property would not meet the standards for a number of reasons. The facade, of course, competes with that of the wood-framed house. Neither stone structure existed while Mark Twain lived on the property. It could be said even that building it so close and disrupting the interaction of the house with weather could endanger it. But today, our understanding has come to see 1930s WPA architecture as historically significant in its own right, and the Stone Museum and Wall may well have acquired their own significance, and so they are preserved alongside with the Mark Twain home. And I'll hand it back to Chris now.
Standard number 5, distinctive features, finishes, and construction techniques or examples of craftsmanship that characterize a property shall be preserved. So in this example, this house retains its, original staircase, woodwork, trim doors, plaster walls, and hardwoods. And all these features contribute to the character of the property. And so these are all things that tell its story. These are items that we would want retained. And we would want the finish of these materials retained as well. The stained woodwork is representative of that Victorian style, where painted woodwork would kind of change the story a little bit there. And additionally, historic walls, as much as possible, should remain in place. It wouldn't necessarily be appropriate, according to the standards, to turn a Victorian house with such tiny little rooms into an open floor plan. That division of spaces is a character-defining feature of a Victorian house. And so moving on to standard number 6, I'll actually break this one up into 3 parts because it's kind of a long standard. So the first part of this standard is that deteriorated historic features shall be repaired rather than replaced. I believe this is actually a house here in Springfield, but I don't recall where it is. Maybe in the Midtown
It's that Midtown one.
district. But this is a great example of repairing rather than replacing. Here, they have their historic entry door with its side lights. And you can see that they retained those and refinished them. And I presume that they found that the front door was originally stained, and that is why they went back with that finish. The second part of this standard is where severity of deterioration requires replacement of a distinctive feature. The new feature shall match the old in design, color, texture, and other visual qualities, and where possible, materials. We recognize that sometimes it is cost prohibitive to get the exact same material as what is historically there. And so there is some leeway with material, but it should be compatible. And so a great example of matching the old in terms of design and color texture is this photo here of flooring. This is an example of where you can clearly see they've had to patch in some new historic flooring. And so in an instance like this, they have matched the wood species. They've done new maple in there to go alongside the old. It is the same board width, it's a similar color, and it's run in the same way, which is important. You would not want to run the new boards perpendicular to what is there. And you might laugh at that, but we have seen that many a times. And the third part, replacement of missing features shall be substantiated by documentary, physical, or pictorial evidence. This is a house in Franklin County, I believe, the Twelker House. German vernacular stone house. This house had 2 very large non-historic additions on the front and back of it. It was missing its historic front porch. And so they were actually lucky enough to have a historic photo of this house with its original front porch, and kind of use that photo to influence their design of a new front porch. It's not an exact match per se, but it's very close.
Oh, back to me.
It is back to you.
Chemical or physical treatments, standard 7 here, such as sandblasting that cause damage to historic materials shall not be used. Surface cleaning, if appropriate, shall be undertaken using the gentlest means possible. Now, I love to point out that there is one treatment and one only specifically cited in the standards, and it is, as you can see, for a negative reason. Sandblasting, media blasting, generally speaking, is notorious for causing irreparable damage to brick masonry, wood, and stone masonry in our field. You see it all the time, and once you start looking, you see it more. Keep in mind that historic brick is softer than modern brick, so it is even more easily damaged. The National Park Service, which points out media blasting in the standards, and then released a couple of its very earliest preservation briefs to address the danger it poses and the alternative measures that can be used, has lots of information about how to care for historic masonry in order to best preserve it. And yes, Preservation Brief 1, 2, 6, and 38 are your masonry sources. On to more masonry. The dangers of incompatible mortar. You can see here what it looks like when you bring Portland cement to a building that would have had a lime-based mortar originally. It's crucial that mortar should be no harder than the brick with which it's used. Again, because historic brick is often much softer, it requires a softer mortar. When the mortar is too hard, it will extrude the brick until it disappears. Standard 8, here's a bit of an outlier. Significant archaeological resources affected by a project shall be protected and preserved. If they must be disturbed, mitigation measures shall be undertaken. This situation rarely arises during rehabilitation projects, in part because most National Register listed or eligible buildings in Missouri either are not located adjacent to known archaeological resources, or maybe the National Register nominations state knowingly the archaeological potential in the region, such as cemeteries. But it is something that becomes a concern, particularly when you see here under both state and federal law, if you discover human remains while working on a project, you are required to stop immediately and contact authorities. And you may well end up in touch with some of our archaeologists over at the SHPO. We'll keep on moving.
Standard number 9, new additions, exterior alterations, or related new construction shall not destroy historic materials that characterize the property. New work shall be differentiated from the old and shall be compatible with the massing, size, scale, and architectural features to protect the historic integrity of the property and its environment. So additions must be compatible in massing, size, and scale primarily, but they also must be differentiated. So this is actually a great example of that. This is that same Christopher Twelker house that had the front porch reconstructed. This is an addition of a new dormer on the rear of it. And so significantly, it is on the rear. It is not a super visible new addition. And they also differentiated it from the historic structure by doing some clapboard siding on it versus the stone construction of the house. The windows are also similar but different. They appear to just be casement or picture windows, but they're comparable to the proportions of the historic windows on the house. And so any additions such as dormers, rooms, or new structures all must be reviewed by SHPO against the standards. Again, even if they are not QRE eligible, they still must be reviewed. Oh, this one's hard to see. But here is another example. That arrow is pointing to the new addition on this one. So this is a small brick commercial building.
I think it's a house.
It's a house? Okay. And there's...
Okay.
Okay. And there's this new frame addition on the rear. And so here's kind of a before and after photo. So you can see that it used to just be a little cutout in the back corner there, and they've kind of enclosed it with this frame addition, again, differentiating the materials, but they're staying within the footprint of the roof, at least. And this is an example where leaving exposed brick would be an acceptable treatment, because this brick wall that you see in the right photo there was historically, as you can see on the left, an exterior wall. And so leaving it exposed helps communicate that, hey, this used to be the exterior. This wasn't always a finished space as it is now. And those are the kind of things that we look for when reviewing new additions and the such.
Okay. Standard 10, this is the end. Yes. New additions and adjacent or related new construction shall be undertaken in such a manner that, if removed in the future, the essential form and integrity of the historic property and its environment would be unimpaired. So this is the George Washington Carver School in Fulton, Missouri. When we had this addition proposed, it still has yet to be built, but the proposal in the rear, you can see, is differentiated by height when looking at it from the public right-of-way here. The addition appears subordinate in height and clearly differentiated also by the windows, which retain a similar grid pattern, but once again, the key word with additions is compatible, but differentiated. And we do have a photo of the site plan as well here. Yes. A good example of how pre-application consultation can avoid delays in review and approval of a project when looking at this site plan. It was not the first design that was shown to the SHPO reviewers, but the project was able to be revised to minimize the addition size, its visibility, its impact on the overall site, and note that it doesn't obscure the view or encapsulate really any portion of that historic building. It can be easily removed without impairing the form and integrity of the historic property, principally because you see the hyphen, the connector there between the two, runs from the white, the addition, to a historic entrance in the back of the school building. So that if ever it were to be severed, it could be done without damaging any historic structure. And just to note some more National Park Service resources, we discussed the preservation briefs briefly. Technical Preservation Services is the name of our counterpart unit, so to say, of the National Park Service. Of course, they have reviewers that they assign out to each state, but whereas we're APS, they are TPS, and they write lots of preservation briefs and other very helpful guidance. We talked about replacement materials. They have a great guidance on that that we refer to anyone who says, well, I'd like to maybe go back with this historic wood product with something fiberglass, say. And they're increasingly working on guidances for energy efficiency and flood abatement and those sorts of things.
So getting started, what are the first steps when planning a rehabilitation project? We'll go through these real quick. So number one, read the instructions. It's like when you're building the couch from IKEA, read the instructions. Otherwise, it's going to fall apart. So NPS has a published application guide on their website, which we highly, highly encourage anyone to read before applying. And this, I think, was updated to reflect that it's now digital submission as well. They no longer require you to submit paper copies because we are in 2024 now. They just did that, what, last year? So, yes. So this is another document which we actually have on the table over there as one of our handouts. It was written by NPS in 2007, and it specifically focuses on Main Street commercial buildings. But it does not, as it's from 2007, reflect that digital submissions are the new norm with this application.
As for photographs, and we do a whole lot of advising people on photographs, frequent subject of concern. Do not, another all caps, begin or allow any work, demolition, construction, before getting your full set of before photographs or existing condition photographs. When you take those documentation, you are communicating to us the beginning condition of your project. And if you start your project before, then we can't review the original state. Yes, it's also important to get not just the entire beginning conditions inside and out of the property, but that entirety of the site and environment. If you have a big lot, the landscape itself needs to be documented, and that includes down the street angles, essentially communicating the surroundings of your property. Not everything has Google Street View, and we also your application should be so complete as to not require necessarily the reviewer to drop their pin in what is often only a 2007 panorama. Photographs must be clear and have sufficient resolution to show the details required for review of rehabilitation work. They must be in color. And then the number of photographs, people often ask, how many do I need? Is there an upper limit? Is there a lower limit? Our response is that however many you need to adequately, quote unquote, tell the story of your property. Applications with photographs that are not adequate for review will be placed on hold, and applicants will need to submit better quality photographs before that review can be completed. We'll talk more about holds later, but that's a frequent one. Some examples of photography. That's an old flounder house on the rear, isn't it, Chris?
Looks like it.
In St. Louis. So this is just a sampling of the kind of shots you would get of a house on the exterior. And I guess
some site and environment.
Indeed.
And some interior ones as well.
Oh, yes, and we have that in the next one. Oh, okay. You're already on to the interior. We beg maybe a little bit that you photograph the exterior, interior particular in a logical sequence that can be easily followed by the reviewers. By that, I mean that 1, 2, 3, 4, say, you're entering from the door. It makes logical sense to take a picture from that door. And again, if we're thinking about primary spaces, that is your entry point. That is where a lot of your character defining features might be expected to be. But also take a picture from the other side of that room of, say, the entrance, so that you are cataloging the most expansive view possible of really each and every room. And that gets complicated, or lengthy at least, when you get to large and complex structures. But for homes in particular, it's crucial to get on opposite corners usually of a room in order to get your best details. For state applications, you can either submit PDFs or JPEGs. The federal applications, Chris, you brought up the instruction page earlier, right? The NPS instructions are great. They have you, for the federal application, putting photos in a single PDF file with maximum of 2 photos per page, all dated, though you don't have to put a date on every photo if indeed you took them all the same day, for example. For the state program, we understand DED has been accepting both its normal submission process of JPEGs, of just photos submitted, individual files, or the PDF from the federal application. If you are doing both applications, they are also accepting that page for the state photos, which greatly simplifies the photo cataloging for people who are simultaneously applying to both programs. Problems to avoid, and these are fun photos. Rooms that are too dark so that we can't see what features are in there. Rooms that are obscured by junk or furniture even. I mean, furniture that might obscure a historic feature. And it is surprising how often that happens. I mean, these projects often take place either when a building is abandoned for a while, being used as storage, or when, say, tenants in a residential place have a lot sitting around. But it's important that we see, for example, what the trim on along the floor looks like. And we don't see that here. A lot of people also forget to uncover the windows when you have shades like the one on the left. Okay, taking a little turn. Hiring a preservation consultant. We have an entire talk dedicated to that subject, but I will cover some of our favorite points. We should stress applicants do not have to use a consultant. The Main Street pamphlet there, again, from the national parks, a little bit outdated. It makes the statement on the back that most applicants for historic main streets do not have a consultant. That is not the case. In Missouri, I can tell you, most of our applications not only come from consultants, but from about the same cast of characters, no more than 10 or so people. That said, it's entirely possible to do this application process on your own, and we do not discourage it. And we are available. We make ourselves available for as much discussion as necessary with first-time applicants, for example, to help them through the process. It can be lengthy and complicated, though, so no wonder that professionals make a good living helping people navigate through this process. A good consultant needs to know those SOI standards, should be able to advise you on what National Park Service reviewers might respond with, what is unlikely to get their approval. They should understand what our determinations mean when you receive an opinion, a condition in response to your submission, be able to interpret that. Keep in mind, they do not work for SHPO. Your consultant works for you. And so that means they don't speak for our office, but they are there to help you. And yes, no one has the authority to approve except DED upon our recommendation for the state projects and National Park Service for the federal. We highly encourage people to exercise due diligence before hiring consultants, that you identify, interview multiple people just as you would for your contractors. And we do maintain a consultants list at our website, which is not endorsement or referral, just a list that we curate of people who meet a certain qualified standard. And note that the project success does not rely solely on the consultant. It is the applicant who bears the risk if really any player in the process were to jeopardize the project by, say, not adhering to something conditioned by the National Park Service. That is the owner, the applicant's project that is put at risk.
All right. Pre-consultations with your SHPO tax credit reviewers. We are available for pre-consultations for tax credit applications at any time. That says Tuesday afternoon and Thursday morning by appointment. Those are our preferred times, but we can also do other times as well. Even before submitting an application, I mean, it's good to have a pre-consultation. We highly recommend it. We find that it just makes projects go by smoother and, again, gets everybody on the same page, which is always a good thing. We're available for consultations at any time and site visits as well. Normally, we will initiate the site visit, but you can also request one as well.
So I'd like to leave 5 minutes for questions at the end. So I think we'll try to speed up here. We'll try to avoid delays. Now, we understand and recognize that delays in the process negatively impact everyone, particularly if you're the owner of a property, if you're paying interest to a bank. Time is money. Everyone's goal is for the application to be processed as smoothly and as quickly as possible. We, again, don't have a statutory review period as of yet, but we try to keep our the time the application is in our office to 30 days. Currently, we're not having trouble with that. Our application volume is rather low. On to incomplete state applications, though. Now, this is a frequent problem for state and federal. When state agency applications are submitted to Department of Economic Development, they're forwarded to SHPO for that architectural review again. If you fail to include all the required information, DED will not forward it to us, or say if we catch the application having incomplete review or incomplete information, and this happens all the time for the federal application, certainly. Oh, wait, we'll talk about that on the next page.
Yeah, I mean, it.
I added this. I haven't talked to you about it yet.
It's okay. We'll survive.
That was the DED's review of economic development. It can cause delays that reporting.
Yeah.
Yeah, we don't really know how long they take in their review process. I mean, I think they vary just as we do. Typically things, I mean, certainly come to us typically under a month. 2 weeks, I think, is probably their usual turnaround. But if you're counting the clock and saying it's been 30 days since I've heard after I submitted my application, remember that in both processes, while we have that 30-day window or try to, we are working with partners.
Yeah. And so as Ethan was saying, I mean, incomplete applications are a common cause for delays. And so stuff we look for when we receive it, common things that are missing are signature or your social security number, TIN number on the cover sheet, photos that aren't properly labeled, keyed, naming conventions not being followed, lack of a district map or site map, and also a transmittal log. These are all frequent things that we are missing on applications that cause delays. And we do have a checklist, which is there to help you make sure you're sending everything that is needed.
And I know it gets aggravating to try to read over a document 100 times to make sure of its completeness. But imagine for a moment what it looks like in our office when you're missing a field, a required field on your tax credit submission, where it sits on the shelf and then one of our admins isn't able to intake it. So it doesn't actually get on our desk to review, and then it has to go back to you. And you may have just lost a couple of weeks there, I'm afraid. So better to read it over.
So district maps are things that any property that's part of a historic district the application must include a copy of the district map, which can be found on the National Register nomination for that district. And then a site plan or site map is also a required document and must identify all resources on the site. That is, whether they are receiving QREs or not, it must identify all resources within the historic boundary.
Yes, and I realize we haven't actually talked about holds, I guess, in abstract. So when an application is received and logged into our system, the SHPO reviewer may place it on hold if there's not enough information to complete the review. So again, common reasons for holds can be inadequate information, inadequate photos, documentation. Sorry, Chris, can you do some clicking?
Yeah, sorry.
And this is a bigger picture problem, if the proposed scope of work fails to discuss parts of the property, mentions features, but lacks necessary drawings, for example, window drawings. Now this is a good time to note that narrative in our review takes precedence over the supporting materials, drawings, plans. It is really the primary source for our review, in that someone might say, see plans for this, but ultimately all features, all items of work should be described in that narrative. And oh yes, and a hold will slow you down, either for the state or the federal program. In the event of a hold, you receive an email message specifying what's needed. It will inform you whether you need an amendment or whether you can just submit some more information. And for the federal program, NPS has been asking us to forward incomplete applications if they've been sitting on the shelf too long waiting for responses. So be mindful that it's important to respond.
Another reason for a National Park Service hold, because they also can place a federal application on hold, is for unpaid fees. Once they receive the Part 2 or Part 3 application, they will contact you requesting payment of the review fee. They will not begin their review until you have paid that fee. And that fee is divided in half between both the Part 2 and the Part 3. There's no review fee for amendments or the Part 1 application. And so there's an example of how the fee is calculated.
What are the state fees?
So the state fees, I believe it's equal to 4% of the amount of tax credits issued. And it's paid to DED when the review is complete. But they will not issue the tax credits until you pay that fee. 4.5? Okay. I knew it was around 4% somewhere. Another reason NPS may put something on hold is they may request more information if they deem that they need that. All right, now 2 keys to success.
You're first up here.
So number 1, plan ahead and know before you go. Yes, because rehabilitating a historic building according to the standards is, I mean, it is quite different from other types of renovations or rehabilitations. Be sure your expectations, you understand the expectations before you submit and create your proposal. Don't become too attached to your proposal. they may have to change in order to meet the standards. And I will say it's quite rare that we receive an application that does not at least have some request for change.
Some kind of condition.
Yes. And so, again, we recommend that you wait for signed approval before starting any work in order to ensure that there are as few issues as possible.
So we suggest, sometimes we beg, but scheduling a pre-application consultation meeting with us SHPO reviewers, particularly if you are a first-time or first-time in a while applicant, or if you are working with a tricky site or idea for the rehabilitation of a building, that it is best not for us and the National Parks reviewers to see it cold out of nowhere. We are available to make those appointments ahead of your submission of the project, and even site visits sometimes.
Did I say wait for signed approval?
Yes, you did.
Wait for signed approval before starting work. I guarantee you that will make your project go so much quicker.
And approval does come from DED for those state applications.
Mhm.
So
Or National Park Service for federal.
right. Stick to the plan. And this is important particularly because, again, not only does that narrative have primacy in the application, but the whole application itself is somewhat of a binding promise that this is the project you have planned on. And if it changes, then that is when we need an amendment to describe any part of the scope of work that is not going to adhere to what was submitted earlier. Even if it adheres to the standards, it is something that needs to be submitted for review because when we get to that final certification phase, whether state or federal, and the project is different than described, that is a big red flag.
Yes. And finally, be sure to read all emails you receive from SHPO. If you have a consultant or a project contact, they will always be included on those emails. It is ultimately up to the applicant to make all the decisions and make sure communication is happening. So.
And we do send out like official correspondence, particularly for the state program, via email. So when you fill out that application, make sure that email will be functioning. And that's it.
That's our spiel.
Thank you for preserving Missouri history, and I presume being stewards of some historic buildings out there in southwestern Missouri, some of which may be in need of rehabilitation. So if you have questions, we might have just a couple minutes here.
Well, of course, if anyone has any questions, please.
So when we were talking about rehabilitating schools,
Mhm.
you mentioned, that it was important those characteristics that brought you back to what it originally was.
Right.
How does that work whenever you also have a remediation project going
Mhm.
on a site that's getting the tax credits? A lot of times like we're talking about that. And so it's going to go into potential issue if they're getting problems.
Sure.
Well, one possible treatment for a lot of hazardous materials is often not to touch them. In the case of lead paint, or to encapsulate them, I mean that is something that asbestos tile could remain in a project or even be uncovered, and those could be certainly eligible treatments.
I just wasn't sure how those two programs like go.
Yeah, and they're always difficult dilemmas. I mean, there are just with energy efficiency questions and flood-prone buildings. There are going to be times where we really need to lean on, say, the guidance that has been issued by the National Park Service because we are faced with multiple difficult questions. How do you remediate hazardous materials? and retain character defining features. That's a good dilemma that I'm not so sure I've been forced into a difficult situation yet, but it's surely coming.
At the very beginning, you had your part one, part two, part three, and completion of work.
Mhm.
When it comes to this process, do you ever establish timelines from when you begin until that work is completed as far as timeframes in which to accomplish whatever project is?
Are you asking required timelines?
Yeah, is there any kind of timeline based on scope of the project? I mean, if one takes 2 years, one takes.
I will tell you that I just reviewed an amendment for a project that started in 2015 the other week. There, yeah.
There isn't a state, but the federal program requires that you make that qualified rehab, spend half of the basis in the 24 months. That gets complicated.
Yeah,
You also do a phase project. and
Yeah.
that will be 5.
the only times there are sort of time constraints in this process are the measuring periods Deb is talking about, and that exists for the federal and the state program. I won't go into the state programs because they may well be changing in the near future. But yeah, the federal program, you need to spend a certain amount of, you need to spend up to your adjusted basis, the formula we discussed earlier, within a threshold that if you have, say, a larger project or a project that you can come up with a phase determination for, then you can expand that window a little bit. And we've seen that on a lot of projects recently. The only other time that we ask for something within a limited period is when there are conditions on we respond or the National Park Service responds to a project and we ask for an amendment within a certain time period.
National Park Service will archive and close a project if there is no activity in 7 years. We found out. So.
And maybe time for one more question.
Many of us put in our federal application at the same time we do our state application.
Mhm.
It's the 30-day clock, the ideal 30-day clock for review start when you get that federal. It's the same scope of work in both, but I've heard you say a couple of things. It sounds like you don't look at it. State. Or do you go-
Oh, no, I'm sorry if that's what was heard. No, so the federal program is sort of the leader in the sense that the state program is designed in many ways to mimic it, right? And if in the case, frequent case, that a project is both federal and state, what we will do is refer to the national parks determination as essentially sufficing for the state application. So when we receive, say, a federal and a state application at the same time, we're going to process that federal review. And then when we have heard back from the National Park Service, we'll issue our determination for the state review as well. It's always helpful to hide behind the fence.
If there are no other questions, we can take our break now and we'll reconvene at 3:30. Of course, we're all, the three of us in our unit will be here after the prayers of to answer any questions.
Indeed. Thank you for your patience.